Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari A to Z, a series of short playthroughs of Atari 8-bit games, some of which I grew up with and some which are new to me. Today is one of the latter. Today we're looking at Elevator Repairman, which was a 1985 type-in listing from Analog magazine, issue 34, developed by Fred Caprilli. The game was inspired by Penguin Software's 1982 title The Spy's Demise, but without that game's notorious cryptogram puzzle. That's something we'll look into in a bit more detail if we ever cover that game. Caprilli noted that he specifically kept the game's visuals very simple in order to make it practical to type in. If you put too much detail in there, then it would have been an even longer listing than it already was. It was a machine code type-in listing, so it was one of the more complicated ones to type in as well. But despite sort of deliberately scaling things back in order to keep things practical to type in, he still managed to put together a colourful arcade style game with plenty of personality. So let's go play Elevator Repairman.
Okay, here we are with Elevator Repairman by Fred Caprilli, copyright 1985, Analog Computing. As I say, this was a type-in listing that you can go and type in for yourself if you want, or you can just, download it, which is much easier. But yeah, this is a fun little game. As a type-in listing, it's obviously fairly simple. As you said, the whole thing fits in 3K, which is nice. But as Fred Caprilli said, he deliberately cut down a bit on graphics in order to make it more practical to type in, because some of these machine code listings could get very long indeed. I speak from experience as someone who typed in a fair few of them in my day. Alright, so the way this game works is you are the little Mario looking dude. Whoops. And it is your aim to get to the top of the, I think it's called like the Prismatic Hotel or something like that, the Prismacolor Hotel. Because all the elevators are going haywire, as you can see. And so you have to make your way up the fire escapes on either side of each floor in order to get to the control room at the top. Oh dear. Well, I'm not getting splattered by elevators in the process. And while listening to a charming little rendition of the Peter Gunn theme, which a lot of Atari 8-bit gamers will probably better know as the theme to Spy Hunter. Usually you get points each time you ascend a floor. And those points are based on that timer at the top of the screen. So the more time that's left on that clock at the top, the more points you'll get. And you'll see when you start a new floor, the timer resets to 250. Which is about 25 seconds-ish. Maybe a little bit slower. It would have been faster on NTSC machines, as remember that Analog was an American magazine, so this would have probably run a little bit faster on American machines, so that timer would have probably been closer to 25 seconds. Whereas now we can see that that last digit is not tenths of a second by any means. Oh, nearly there. Used most of my lives, though. Okay, and then when you've done it, you do it all again. Except a couple of the elevators are a little bit faster. So, the nice thing about type-in listings in magazines was... Oh dear, that was stupid. The nice thing about type-in listings from magazines was that they were often a good way to learn and refine your own skills at programming, because more often than not, the people who design them would actually provide some commentary on how they put the game together. And how they achieved the various things that the game was doing. So, for example, if you go and look back on the issue of Analog magazine that this game appeared in, which you can do if you go over to Atari Mania and check out their magazine section, they have a huge archive of PDFs of all of the popular Atari magazines from the UK, from America, and from some mainland European countries as well, I believe. It's got some newsletters from, I think, Germany, possibly Poland as well. I forget. I haven't looked at the stuff in languages that I can't understand for obvious reasons. But there's certainly a very comprehensive archive of stuff there, including, I believe, a complete collection of analogues. So you can actually go and look up this game and see what the designer was trying to achieve with it and how he accomplished some of the things that were going on in the game. So from what I can make out, there are aspects of programming the Atari 8-bit that I've never quite understood fully, and one of those things was the hardware sprites, which are known as player missile graphics. The limit of my knowledge on those is that there were 8 of them altogether. There were 4 players, which were larger sprites, and there were 4 missiles, which were tiny sprites. And as their name suggests, the players were intended to be used for player-controlled characters, and missiles were intended to be used for sort of shots. So I think the whole system was sort of designed with like a sort of Space Invaders game in mind or something like that. So you would use the players to create the thing that the player was controlling. Oops. And then you would use the missiles to depict whatever it was they were shooting. Now, obviously, not every game is a shoot-'em-up. And so a lot of developers found very creative ways to make use of those 8 sprites in order to create various effects. And reading the commentary on this game in Analog, it seems that this is an example of that. So all of the elevators in the middle are made using the hardware sprites. With a bit of trickery going on, because obviously in the case of the missiles, those are very small. And in the case of the players, there's a limit to how many there could be on screen. But basically how it worked, from what I could make out, is that the elevators were done in pairs, and basically one sprite was used for 2 elevators. But you can't tell, can you? Because like, if you look at the way the elevators are moving on screen, some of them are moving at the same speed, but they're not moving like in perfectly synchronized positions or anything like that. So it's a very clever use of the inherent limitations of the hardware to create something that worked well for this kind of game. And this is one of the things that it was always great to see in these type-in listings, because very often the programmers were very pleased with the things they'd managed to achieve using either Atari Basic or assembly language, or in rare instances proprietary languages like Action. And so rather than trying to keep their skills to themselves, they would share them with other people. So saying, look what I did. Look what I did. Here's how I did it. If you want to try it for yourself, this is how you can do it. And thus, if you were so inclined, if you already had your head around the basics of like assembly language or basic or whatever, then you can absolutely learn a lot by typing these listings in. I know I did. Like, even though I was quite young when I was typing most of these in and didn't understand the more complex stuff like assembly language, and still don't, to be perfectly honest. But the basic programs, yeah, I developed a very good understanding of Atari Basic thanks to all of the stuff that I typed in. And that then led me on and inspired me to write my own programs. Nothing complicated or impressive or indeed worth showing you, but things that I was pleased with, things that I was pleased to have created successfully. But yeah, looking at the issue of Analog that this came from, I found it very interesting because there were some very specific pieces of advice on things to do in assembly language to get things running smoothly and looking good on the screen. So all the things you should load into various memory addresses and that kind of thing. It's really interesting to see and very different from the culture surrounding programming now. I mean, there are still elements of that around, like the open source movement is all based on sharing things and building on each other's work, but when you look at like commercial software, outside of sort of middleware solutions and game engines and that sort of thing, people tend to keep themselves to themselves. And if they achieve something particularly cool, rather than that being something they necessarily want to share with the community, they'll keep that for themselves, and that will be their unique selling point for their game. There are exceptions to this, of course. If you look at communities built around the particular pieces of game-making software, like the RPG Maker community, for example, there are people who have made careers out of figuring out how to do complicated things and then sharing that information with the public. So yeah, I guess I'm contradicting myself slightly. It does still go on a bit, but not in quite the same way. And that's partly due to the fact that the games and tech press we have today does not take the same form as it was in the 80s by any means. The idea of buying a magazine and being expected to type in a program for you to use yourself rather than it being included on a website to download or that sort of thing is unthinkable these days. Actually doing quite well this time around. I am on my last life though. Oh, no, it's all over. It's all over. This is a fun game. It's one of those ones that's really simple and easy to get into. The rules are very easy to understand, and there's no real sort of depth to it in terms of mechanics, but it works as a game. And it's presented well and it's slick. I'd go so far as to say that this is commercial quality. This is the kind of game that I could see being released on a cartridge with the system, or on a cassette, or a disc. Probably cassette. But yeah, indeed, there are budget price releases for the Atari 8-bit that are worse than this game. But then we are talking about Analog Magazine. If you know your Atari magazines, you will know that Analog specifically was very well known for its extremely high standard of type-in listings. Analog seemed to pride itself on publishing these machine code games that ran a lot quicker and more smoothly and could generally do more than something written in BASIC. I mean, there were people who could get wonderful things out of Atari BASIC as well, of course, but if you were to try and recreate this game in Atari BASIC, it wouldn't move nearly as smoothly or as quickly, or you'd probably have to sit around waiting for ages when it started up for it to redefine the character set and that sort of thing, and to create the player missiles. But yeah, this was one of Analog's specialisms in the field of type-in listings. If you wanted top-notch free machine code games for your Atari, you'd buy a copy of Analog and spend a bit of time typing it in. And Analog was influential in its own way too. So the way it would work for typing these in is you would type in a basic listing, which included a whole bunch of data statements in hexadecimal. And then that basic listing would convert that hexadecimal code into computer data and then write it to a cassette or a disk that you could then boot from. And in that way, you'd end up with a standalone disk or cassette with a game on it. And the routine that Analog used for that became sort of the industry standard, as it were. You've heard me mention Page 6 magazine numerous times on this series. Page 6 magazine also published a lot of machine code games, because there are several regular contributors who were very good at composing machine code games. People like Paul Lay and Bill Halsall, and probably some others I haven't thought of. Those are the two that immediately spring to mind. But yeah, they always used Analog's loader routine for turning those data statements into bootable cassettes and discs. Oh no, that's awkward. Yeah, I always found it like kind of black magic, how you can turn a string of seeming gibberish hexadecimal into something like this. And it was always a wonderful, almost magical moment when you finished typing one of these things and you saved the basic listing to disk, and then you ran the program, and it would go through and it would meticulously check all your lines of data against the checksums that were also provided. And then it would go, yes, you typed this in correctly. Please insert a disk. And then you'd pop that disk in and it would write it to the disk. And then, with a certain degree of trepidation, you would reboot your computer with that disk in the drive. And then there would be a game to play. It was kind of a wonderful thing in a lot of ways. And again, something that we don't really have today, because yes, sure, you have the anticipation of downloading something or that kind of thing, but there's just that slight element of do-it-yourself that came from typing in a listing from the magazine. Just gave it a really wonderful sense of satisfaction. It's like you felt like you'd achieved something when you typed one of these in. Even though you hadn't written the program yourself, you'd still taken the time to meticulously copy it from the magazine into your computer. And you'd be rewarded for it with a wonderful piece of software to enjoy. Usually a wonderful piece of software anyway. There were exceptions. But for the most part, the magazines were quite picky about the programs that they accepted, and they wouldn't accept something that was obvious garbage. Oh, it's all over. Alright, that is Elevator Repairman. A lot of fun. And yeah, something I would have been very excited to type in back in the day, but we didn't have this particular issue of Analog, I guess. But yeah, glad to experience it now. That's a fun game and a great example of the high standard of software that was available from Analog magazine. So yeah, check that out if you get a chance. It's a fun, enjoyable, arcadey game that's worth a play. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.